The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding by Agatha Christie, Part 2.1. Part 2 is really long, so I'm splitting it into two. The temperature in the long drawing-room at King's Lacey was a comfortable 68 Fahrenheit, which actually is quite comfortable, a little bit lower than room temperature, I believe. As Hercule Poirot sat talking to Mrs. Lacey by one of the big mullioned windows. A mullioned window is just a normal window that's, the glass panes are in sections. Mrs. Lacey was engaged in needlework. She was not doing petit point or embroidered flowers upon silk. Instead, she appeared to be engaged in the prosaic task of hemming dishcloths. Prosaic is like not poetic, not fancy. She was just fixing dishcloths. As she sewed, she talked in a soft, reflective voice that Poirot found very charming. "I hope you will enjoy our Christmas party here, Monsieur Poirot. It's only the family, you know. My granddaughter and a grandson and a friend of his, and Bridget, who's my great-niece, and Diana, who's a cousin, and David Welwyn, who's a very old friend. Just a family party. But Edwina Morecombe said that's what you really wanted to see. An old-fashioned Christmas. Nothing could be more old-fashioned than we are. My husband, you know, absolutely lives in the past. He likes everything to be just as it was when he was a boy of 12 years old, and used to come here for his holidays." She smiled to herself. "All the same old things, the Christmas tree and the stockings hung up, and the oyster soup and the turkey, 2 turkeys, 1 boiled and 1 roast, and the plum pudding with the ring and the bachelor's button and all the rest of it in it. We can't have 6pences nowadays because they're not pure silver anymore. But all the old desserts, the Elvas plums, the Colsbin plums, and almonds and raisins and crystallized fruit and ginger. Dear me, I sound like a catalogue from Fortnum and Mason. You arouse my gastronomic juices, madame." Gastronomic, like digestive. But that might be the same word in Swedish, I don't know. "I expect we'll all have frightful indigestion by tomorrow evening," said Mrs. Lacey. "One isn't used to eating so much nowadays as one." She was interrupted by some loud shouts and whoops of laughter outside the window. She glanced out. "I don't know what they're doing out there. Playing some game or other, I suppose. I've always been so afraid, you know, that these young people would be bored by a Christmas here. But not at all, it's just the opposite. Now, my own son and daughter and their friends, they used to be rather sophisticated about Christmas. Say it was all nonsense and too much fuss, and it would be far better to go out to a hotel somewhere and dance. But the younger generation seem to find all this terribly attractive. Besides," added Mrs. Lacey practically, "schoolboys and schoolgirls are always hungry, aren't they? I think they must starve them in these schools. After all, one does know children of that age each eat about as much as 3 strong men." Poirot laughed and said, "It is most kind of you and your husband, madame, to include me this way in your family party." "Oh, we're both delighted, I'm sure," said Mrs. Lacey. "And if you find Horace a little gruff," she continued, "pay no attention. It's just his manner, you know." What her husband, Colonel Lacey, had actually said was, "Can't think why you want one of these damned foreigners here cluttering up Christmas. Why can't we have him some other time? Can't stick foreigners. All right, so Edwina Morecombe wished him on us. What's it got to do with her, I should like to know? Why doesn't she have him for Christmas? Or why doesn't she have him for Christmas?" "Because you know very well," Mrs. Lacey had said, "that Edwina always goes to Claridge's." Her husband had looked at her piercingly and said, "Not up to something, are you, Em?" "Up to something?" said Em, opening her very blue eyes. "Of course not. Why should I be?" Old Colonel Lacey laughed, a deep, rumbling laugh. "Wouldn't put it past you, Em," he said. "When you look your most innocent, it's when you're up to something." Revolving these things in her mind, Mrs. Lacey went on. "Edwina said she thought, perhaps you might help us. I'm sure I don't know quite how, but she said that friends of yours had once found you very helpful in a case something like ours. Well, perhaps you don't know what I'm talking about?" Poirot looked at her encouragingly. Mrs. Lacey was close on 70, as upright as a ramrod, with snow-white hair, pink cheeks, blue eyes, and a ridiculous nose, and a determined chin. "If there is anything I can do, I shall only be happy to do it," said Poirot. "It is, I understand, a rather unfortunate matter of a girl's infatuation." Infatuation? Infatuation? Mrs. Lacey nodded. "Yes, it seems extraordinary that I should, well, want to talk to you about it. After all, you are a perfect stranger." "And a foreigner," said Poirot, in an understanding manner. "Yes," said Mrs. Lacey. "But perhaps that makes it easier in a way. Anyhow, Edwina seemed to think that you might perhaps know something, how shall I put it, something useful about this young Desmond Lee Wortley." Poirot paused for a moment to admire the ingenuity of Mr. Jesmond and the ease with which he had made use of Lady Morecombe to further his own purposes. Apparently Desmond Lee Wortley is kind of on the radar of Mr. Jesmond, kind of as a bad guy, and that's part of the reason he sent Poirot to the King's Lacey. Yeah. Anyway. Guys, I'm recording something. Hello. These are the kids I live with. They're just singing in the kitchen. Anyway. Where was I? Yes. He has not, I understand, a very good reputation, this young man, he began delicately. "No, indeed, he hasn't. Very bad reputation. But that's no help so far as Sarah is concerned. It's never any good, is it, telling young girls that men have a bad reputation? It just spurs them on." "You are so very right," said Poirot. "In my young day," went on Mrs. Lacey, oh dear, that's a very long time ago, "we used to be warned, you know, against certain young men, and of course it did heighten one's interest in them. And if one could possibly manage to dance with them, or to be alone with them in a dark conservatory," she laughed, "that's why I wouldn't let Horace do any of the things he wanted to do." "Tell me," said Poirot, "exactly what is it that troubles you?" "Our son was killed in the war," said Mrs. Lacey. My daughter-in-law died when Sarah was born, so that she has always been with us, and we've brought her up. Perhaps we've brought her up unwisely, I don't know, but we thought we ought always to leave her as free as possible." "That is desirable, I think," said Poirot. "One cannot go against the spirit of the times." "No," said Mrs. Lacey, "that's just what I felt about it. And, of course, girls nowadays do these sort of things." Poirot looked at her inquiringly, like, huh? "I think the way one expresses it," said Mrs. Lacey, "is that Sarah has got in with what they call the coffee bar set. She won't go to dances, or come out properly, or be a deb, like a debutante, or anything of that kind. Instead, she has 2 rather unpleasant rooms in Chelsea down by the river, and wears these funny clothes that they like to wear, and black stockings, or bright green ones, very thick stockings, so prickly, I always think, and she goes about without washing or combing her hair." "Ça, c'est tout à fait naturel," said Poirot. "It is the fashion of the moment. They grow out of it." "Yes, I know. I wouldn't worry about that sort of thing, but you see she's taken up with this Desmond Lee Wortley, and he really has a very unsavoury reputation. He lives more or less on well-to-do girls. They seem to go quite mad about him. He's very nearly married the Hope girl, but her people got her made a ward in court or something, and of course that's what Horace wants to do. He says he must do it for her protection. But I don't think it's really a good idea, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot. A French name with a British accent. Anyway. I mean, they'll just run away together and go to Scotland or Ireland. Ireland, Ireland, or the Argentine, or somewhere, and either get married or else live together without getting married. And although it may be contempt of court and all that, well, it isn't really an answer, is it, in the end? Especially for babies coming. One has to give in then and let them get married. And then, nearly always, it seems to me, after a year or two, there's a divorce. And then the girl comes home, and usually after a year or two, she marries someone so nice he's almost dull and settles down. But it's particularly sad, it seems to me, if there is a child, because it's not the same thing, being brought up by a stepfather, however nice. No, I think it's much better if we did as we did in my young days. I mean, the first young man one fell in love with was always someone undesirable. I remember I had a horrible passion for a young man called... What was his name now? How strange it is, I can't remember his Christian name at all. Tibbet, that was his surname, young Tibbet. Of course, my father more or less forbade him in the house. But he used to get asked to the same dances, and we used to dance together, and sometimes we'd escape and sit out together, and occasionally friends would arrange picnics to which we both went. Of course, it was all very exciting and forbidden, and one enjoyed it enormously, but one didn't go to the lengths that girls go nowadays, and so, after a while, the Mr. Tibbets faded out. And you know, when I saw him 4 years later, I was surprised that what I could ever have seen in him. He seemed to be such a dull young man. Flashy, you know, no interesting conversation. One always thinks the days of one's own youth are best, said Parot, somewhat sententiously. Sententious is like moralizing, so he's almost like preaching to her. I know, said Mrs. Lacey. It's tiresome, isn't it? I mustn't be tiresome, but all the same, I don't want Sarah, who's a dear girl really, to marry Desmond Lee Wortley. She and David Welwyn, who is staying here, were always such friends and so fond of each other, and we did hope, Horace and I, that they would grow up and marry. But of course she just finds him dull now, and she's absolutely infatuated with Desmond. I do not quite understand, madame, said Parot. You have him here now, staying in the house, this Desmond Lee Wortley? That's my doing, said Mrs. Lacey. Horace was all for forbidding her to see him and all that. Of course, in Horace's day, the father or guardian would have called round at the young man's lodgings with a horsewhip. Horace was all for forbidding the fellow the house, and forbidding the girl to see him. I told him that was quite the wrong attitude to take. No, I said, ask him down here. We'll have him down for Christmas with the family party. Of course, my husband said I was mad, but I said, at any rate, dear, let's try it. Let her see him in our atmosphere and our house, and we'll be very nice to him and very polite, and perhaps then he'll seem less interesting to her. I think, as they say, you have something there, madame, said Baron. I think your point of view is very wise, wiser than your husband's. Well, I hope it is, said Mrs. Lacey doubtfully. It doesn't seem to be working much yet, but of course he's only been here a couple of days. A sudden dimple showed in her wrinkled cheek. I'll confess something to you, Monsieur Poirot. I myself... Oh, Monsieur Poirot. I myself can't help liking him. I don't mean really like him with my mind, but I can feel the charm all right. Oh yes, I can see what Sarah sees in him. But I'm an old enough woman and have enough experience to know that he's absolutely no good, even if I do enjoy his company. Though I do think, added Mrs. Lacey rather wistfully, he has some good points. He asked if he might bring his sister here, you know. She's had an operation and was in hospital. He said it was so sad for her being in a nursing home over Christmas, and he wondered if it would be too much trouble if he could bring her here with him. He said he'd take all her meals up to her and all that. Well, now, I do think that was rather nice of him, don't you, Monsieur Poirot? Monsieur Poirot. It shows a consideration, said Poirot thoughtfully, which seems almost out of character. Oh, I don't know. You can have family affections at the same time as wishing to prey on a rich young girl. Sarah will be very rich, you know, not only with what we leave her, and of course that won't be very much because most of the money goes with the place to Colin, my grandson, but her mother was a very rich woman, and Sarah will inherit all her money when she's 21. She's only 20 now. Now, I do think it was nice of Desmond to mind about his sister, and he didn't pretend she was anything very wonderful at that. She's a shorthand typist, I gather. There's secretarial work in London, and he's been as good as his word, and does carry up trays to her. Not all the time, of course, but quite often. So I think he has some nice points. But all the same, said Mrs. Lacey with great decision, I don't want Sarah to marry him. From all I have heard and been told, said Barreau, that would indeed be a disaster. Do you think it would be possible for you to help us in any way? Said Mrs. Lacey. I think it possible, yes, said Hercule Poirot, but I do not wish to promise too much, for the Mr. Desmond Lee-Watleys of this world are clever, madame. But do not despair. One can, perhaps, do a little something. I shall, at any rate, put forth my best endeavours, if only in gratitude for your kindness in asking me here for this Christmas festivité. He looked around him. And it cannot be so easy these days to have Christmas festivities. No, indeed. Mrs. Lacey sighed. She leaned forward. Do you know, Monsieur Poirot, what I really dream of, what I would love to have? But tell me, madame. I simply long to have a small, modern bungalow. No, perhaps not a bungalow exactly, but a small, modern, easy-to-run house built somewhere in the park here, and live in it with an absolute up-to-date kitchen and no long passages. Everything easy and simple. It is a very practical idea, madame. It's not practical for me, said Mrs. Lacey. My husband adores this place. He loves living here. He doesn't mind being slightly uncomfortable. He doesn't mind the inconveniences, and he would hate, simply hate, to live in a small modern house in the park. So you sacrifice yourself to his wishes? Mrs. Lacey drew herself up. I do not consider it a sacrifice, Monsieur Poirot, she said. I married my husband with the wish to make him happy. He has been a good husband to me, and made me very happy all these years, and I wish to give happiness to him. So you will continue to live here? Said Poirot. It's not really too uncomfortable, said Mrs. Lacey. No, no, said Poirot hastily. On the contrary. Au contraire. On the contrary. It is most comfortable. Your central heating and your bathwater are perfection. We spent a lot of money on making the house comfortable to live in, said Mrs. Lacey. We were able to sell some land, ripe for development, I think they call it. Fortunately, right out of sight of the house, on the other side of the park. Really rather an ugly bit of ground, with no nice view, but we got a very good price for it. So that we have been able to have as many improvements as possible. But the service, madame? Well, that presents less difficulty than you might think. Of course, one cannot expect to be looked after and waited upon as one used to be. So by service, Poirot means like servants. He's asking about the servants. Different people come in from the village. 2 women in the morning, another 2 to cook lunch and wash it up, and different ones again in the evening. There are plenty of people who want to come and work for a few hours a day. Of course, for Christmas we are very lucky. My dear Mrs. Ross always comes in every Christmas. She's a wonderful cook, really first class. She retired about 10 years ago, but she comes in to help us in any emergency. Then there is dear Peveril. Your butler? Yes, he is pensioned off and lives in the little house near the lodge. But he is so devoted, and he insists on coming to wait on us at Christmas. Really, I'm terrified, Monsieur Poirot, because he's so old and shaky that I feel certain that if he carries anything heavy, he will drop it. It's really an agony to watch him, and his heart is not good, and I'm afraid of his doing too much. But it would hurt his feelings dreadfully if I did not let him come. He hems and haws and makes disapproving noises when he sees the state our silver is in within 3 days of being here. It is all wonderful again. Wonderful again. Yes, he is a dear, faithful friend. She smiled at Poirot. So you see, we are all set for a happy Christmas. A white Christmas, too, she added as she looked up out of the window. See, it's beginning to snow. Ah, the children are coming in. You must meet them, Monsieur Poirot.